Man, 2026 has been a massive year for Anne Hathaway at the box office. First with The Devil Wears Prada 2, then The Odyssey, and this week The End of Oak Street will be hitting theaters. Her success in 2026 is well deserved, but unfortunately for her, I will have to tear this movie a new one when it comes to scientific accuracy. First, let me give a brief synopsis of the film based on the trailers that have come out. In The End of Oak Street, Anne Hathaway's family is living in a nice suburban town when somehow their neighborhood is transported to the Mesozoic, where they encounter a variety of different dinosaurs, including deadly theropods. When I saw the first official trailer, I immediately noticed the allosaurus, and at a first quick glance, I thought the posture and proportions looked solid, although the skull looked identical to the Jurassic World allosaurus. Then, when I looked more closely, I saw a weird texture on its torso and thought, wait, did they put feathers on it? Feathers mixed with osteoderms or small spikes? Of course, my first thought was how paleo inaccurate it is to stick fluffy feathers on an allosaurus, which I will go into more detail on in a moment. My initial guess as to the direction the filmmakers were going was that maybe they were going to stick feathers on all the theropods. Then more photos and clips from the film started to come out in the following weeks, including a photo of woolly sauropods, completely covered in shaggy feathers. Do I even need to explain how this is completely scientifically inaccurate? I might have to explain this to the creature designers on the film, or have them take a drug test, because what the fuck were they smoking to come up with something like this? For anyone else who is not aware, for starters, a multi-ton sauropod would quickly overheat if it was covered in feathers. It takes giant animals such as these a lot longer to lower their body temperature and lose heat. Secondly, paleontologists have found numerous fossilized skin impressions and casts from sauropods, from diplodocids, macronaria such as Stegosaurus, to various titanosaurs, and the fossil evidence shows that sauropods had reptilian scaly skin that came in a variety of patterns. Several titanosaurs, such as Saltosaurus, have also been found with osteoderms, and there are even titanosaur embryos that have scaly skin impressions, which immediately refutes the hypothesis of sauropod hatchlings having fuzz that they lose when they are fully grown. The dino from this film that I really want to focus on is the allosaurus. After seeing the newer trailers and clips, it is apparent that they put feathers on the torso of the allosaurus. There are some people online, including a few content creators, who are defending this design as plausible, even going so far as to say the feathered allosaurus design is just as plausible as the scaly allosaurus design. First off, no, a feathered allosaurus is nowhere near as plausible as a fully scaly allosaurus. Paleontologists have literally found skin impressions from different parts of the body on allosaurus that show reptilian scales, which I will discuss later. But there is positive evidence for a scaly allosaurus, so the burden of proof is on the feathered allosaur advocates to show concrete evidence of feathers on allosaurus if they want to argue that the feathered design is just as plausible. It seems that the people defending the feathered allosaurus as plausible are basing this off the supposed quill knobs of Concavenator and an overly simplistic phylogenetic analysis. There are several paleontologists who disagree with the interpretation that the knobs on the ulna of Concavenator are quill knobs due to their location on the anterolateral side of the ulna. Christian Forth has proposed that they are actually intermuscular lines for tendon attachment. Even if I granted that these are quill knobs, skin impressions showing scales have been found with Concavenator fossils, and based on these skin impressions, Concavenator would have been mostly scaly with stiff quills coming out of its forearm. Also, Allosaurus is separated from Concavenator and the rest of the Carcharodontosaurids by tens of millions of years, which is plenty of time for genetic drift and mutation to cause phenotypic variation between these genera, including with integument. Now, let's talk more about what the integument, or skin, of Allosaurus actually looked like. As I mentioned before, paleontologists have found numerous Allosaurus skin impressions, all of which show scaly skin, similar to the scales seen on the sides of alligators or the pebbly scales on Gila monsters or monitor lizards. Interestingly, the skin impressions from the Allosaurus specimen known as Big Joe are similar to the scales on the underside of snakes, according to Mark Lowen. The skin impressions from other Allosaurus individuals come from various parts of the body, such as the base of the tail on Big Al 2, the pectoral and anterior dorsal rib regions on a juvenile specimen, and the mandible and ventral side of the neck from another specimen. There is another allosaurus specimen discovered in the Jurassic Mile site in Wyoming 2 years ago that has skin impressions from the legs, hips, chest, and neck. All of the skin impressions from these allosaurus specimens show reptilian scales. And these scaly skin impressions are from areas of the body that the creature designer for End of Oak Street decided to stick feathers on. In other words, the parts of the body that the End of Oak Street Allosaurus has feathers on were, in reality, covered in scales based on the fossil evidence. Inevitably, someone is going to respond with, Allosaurus could have had both feathers and scales, maybe it had sparse feathering on its back. They would then point to the species of modern birds that have feathers sticking out between the scales on their feet, or the compsognathid juravenator. First, biologists and geneticists have done studies on birds that have feathers sticking out between the scales on their feet, and what they found is that in order for feathers or filaments to grow on their feet, the gene for hind limb development, PITX1, is either suppressed or dialed down to the point where it has a weak genetic signal, which allows for the activation of the forelimb development gene TBX5 in the feet. As we all know, the forelimbs of birds are wings. In other words, in order for birds to have feathers on their feet or to have feathers sticking out between the scales, the gene for scale development on their feet has to have a weak genetic signal, while the feather development gene has to have a stronger genetic signal. Based on all the Allosaurus skin impressions from various parts of the body that show reptilian scales, it is clear that the genes for producing scales did not have a weak genetic signal, but were very active. Also, because the torso region develops well before the hind limbs in the embryo, it is way more difficult to suppress the genes that produce reptilian scales on the torso. As for juravenator, it does have both scales and filaments, but these are on different parts of the body. The scales are on the tail and legs, while the filaments are on the torso. The scaly skin impressions from Allosaurus were associated with the torso, among other regions. If the End of Oak Street creature designers actually did any research, they would have gone with a scaly Allosaurus. The Allosaurus in Netflix's Life on Our Planet is more accurate than the End of Oak Street Allosaurus in terms of integument. Two other theropods appear in this movie, Spinosaurus and what appears to be Coelophysis. The Spinosaurus design looks alright. My only issues with it are the skull shape and the sparse fuzz or filaments they put on it. The only argument that I can think people would use to justify this is the phylogenetic placement of Sciuromymis in Megalosauroideae. The problem with this is that the phylogenetic analysis used to place Sciuromymis within Megalosauroideae was statistically weak and was missing data on several species. Several other phylogenetic studies have placed Sciuromymis within Coelurosauria, which is the clade where feathers first arose. Since the feather maximalists like to use phylogenetic bracketing, we can infer that Spinosaurus was scaly since Spinosaurids were part of the broader clade Carnosauria, and Allosaurus, a distant cousin of the Spinosaurids, had scaly skin. The point I made about the genes for scale development needing to be dialed down for feathers to grow on bird feet still applies, so if the fellow Carnosaur Allosaurus' skin impressions are any indication, Spinosaurus was scaly. The argument for Coelophysis being covered in feathers rests on the hypothesis that feathers were ancestral to dinosaurs. If one accepts this hypothesis, then it follows that since Coelophysis was a small, early theropod, it would have protofeathers of some sort. I, on the other hand, reject the hypothesis that dinosaurs were ancestrally feathered, because there have been several papers written on this, by Barrett et al. In 2015, Campione et al. In 2020, and Benton et al. In 2024, and they all conclude that dinosaurs were ancestrally scaly. Plus, ceratosaurs, such as Ceratosaurus, have been found with osteoderms, and more advanced ceratosaurs, such as Carnotaurus, show evidence of scales and scutes. Since Coelophysis is a more primitive theropod than the ceratosaurs, it makes sense that it would be scaly as well, since reptilian scales were the ancestral integument for dinosaurs, and more derived theropods like Carnotaurus were scaly. I'll end this video by looking back at when another dinosaur film, Jurassic World, hit theaters over 11 years ago. Paleontologists and laymen alike were right to point out the numerous inaccuracies, because it seemed like a step backwards from the original Jurassic Park trilogy. I was super annoyed by the inaccurate posture of the stegosaurus and the triceratops, especially since the Lost World Jurassic Park got the stegosaurus posture mostly correct. Fast forward 11 years later, it now seems J.J. Abrams wanted to swing the pendulum to the other extreme, putting feathers on dinosaurs that in reality did not have feathers. Can a major Hollywood studio make a dinosaur movie that just uses the designs from Netflix's The Dinosaurs? Because I thought those dinosaur designs were well done. Not to mention that was the best dinosaur documentary series from the past 10 years. Anyways, even though I tore these fluffy designs a new asshole, I still plan on seeing the film, as with any film I make a video on. Let me know in the comments if you guys plan on seeing The End of Oak Street in theaters.